Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has proven himself a survivor in the political arena. His tenure has been marked by major scandals, corruption, cabinet resignations, and apologies. He has also, though, won 3 consecutive majority governments, a feat rarely seen in modern Canadian politics. Lately, though, it seems that a lot of the Teflon coating Ford has enjoyed is starting to wear off. His popularity is dwindling, and the media is pursuing his government with renewed vigor. Are we witnessing the end of the provincial Ford dynasty? And what damage will his administration leave behind him when his term of office is finally over? Joining me to discuss all of this is Bruce Livesey, an award-winning journalist, investigative reporter, and best-selling author with more than 40 years of experience in print, television, radio, newspapers, magazines. And Bruce is the author of the recently published piece for The Breach entitled "The Rise and Potential Fall of Doug Ford." I would also note that Bruce is currently the federal Green Party candidate for the riding of Beaches East York in the upcoming by-election here in Toronto. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thanks, Desmond. Nice to be here.
And as we get started, just a reminder to our audience to please like and subscribe if you want more journalism for transformation. Okay, Bruce, 2025 was a great year for Doug Ford. He won a third majority government after calling an early election, and he rebranded himself as a defender of Ontarians and Canadians against U.S. President Donald Trump. Last summer, polls had him ranked as the most popular conservative in Canada. There were even rumors that he was positioning himself to run for prime minister. Today, though, he ranks as the least popular premier in the country. What happened?
There's been a number of scandals this year which have been particularly problematic. One was earlier this year, it was discovered that the government had spent almost $30 million buying Ford a private jet. And then there was the expense scandal. Basically, what was discovered was that at least 20 cabinet ministers and MPPs had spent close to $120,000 going to downtown Toronto luxury hotels because they couldn't be bothered to go home. One of his ministers, I think it was his tourism minister, who in particular, I think he spent $16,000 alone over just 2 years doing that. There was the fires. Northern Ontario went up in flames this summer, and the fires got out of control. And he wasn't directly connected. If people had looked closer, they would have seen that there had been a big cutbacks in wildlife fire crews over the years. So arguably one of the reasons the fires got out of the control. But I think the other big thing was the Billy Bishop Airport jet expansion. And so the Billy Bishop Airport is the island airport here in downtown Toronto, and the owner of the terminal, which is owned by a consortium owned by JP Morgan, wants to expand the airport to allow jets. And Ford seized the land which the airport sits on and was pushing for this expansion to go ahead, despite it being wildly unpopular. And the Carney government had to step in and say, no, we're not going to approve this. And then I think in the background, there's just been, he has passed so many laws, done so many bad things. He's created a very authoritarian regime and very corrupt regime. And I think that's finally beginning to seep into the subconscious of people.
Yeah, it is easy to forget, as you mentioned in your piece, that Ford actually did struggle to govern right at the beginning of his first term, and he was pretty unpopular just a year into that first term of office. But then the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and Ford made some changes during that time, which seemed to revive his popularity. Can you talk about what changed for Ford after COVID-19 hit?
I mean, the most successful provincial Tory governments have been centrist governments. They were often even leaned red Tory. And you go back to the days of guys like, Bill Davis as an example. The Tories had drifted sort of more and more to the right. And so when Ford came in 2018, he did the usual Tory thing, which is he tried to impose a very harsh right-wing agenda. mean, a lot of the corruption and sort of favoritism, appointing friends to very important posts, was very blatant. So yeah, he was in trouble up until COVID hit, and then, I mean, it's not certain why he makes this switch, but I mean, clearly he knew he had to make a change. And I think listened to certain advisors who said, you have to, rule more from the center. You can't be, this sort of right wing crazy populist. And it worked. He during COVID, he listened to the doctors when they said close down the province. He closed down the province. When the anti-vax, or sort of, I think it was the anti-vaxxers, those who were opposed to restrictions, marched on Ottawa. He didn't, unlike Pierre Poilievre, who's, embraced them. Ford did not. Didn't want anything to do with them. He'd been sort of lambasting the Trudeau government, and he stopped doing that. They began working together, and then he began to see he can get money out of the federal government if they cooperate in certain projects, certain things like infrastructure and whatnot. I mean, the suspicion, and what I was told, was there was a pollster, a guy called Nick Kouvalis, who's a very controversial guy on the right wing, that he was doing effective polling and telling Ford, you can't, this is going to be unpopular, this will be popular. And what I was told was that he began to listen to Kouvalis. And so I think a lot of his decisions, and one of the things I write about was the Greenbelt scandal. His efforts to open it up to development was wildly unpopular. He backed off. So he does have a history of it when he does damage, he does stupid things, and then when they appear to be wildly unpopular, he will back off. But now, ironically, with the airport, he did not. He still stands by that. Like, there was a poll that the federal government was forced um, to do of Toronto residents and their attitudes toward the airport, and 87% said they didn't want it, and Ford still said, "I don't care. I want this airport expansion." So I think you know, he might be losing his touch. I think he's going back to possibly making the mistakes he did in the first part of his first term.
Interestingly, though, something has happened in the last couple of days that kind of makes me think of how skilled he is at sometimes reviving himself after he's kind of stepped in it and holding on to popularity. Obviously, this ongoing trade war with the United States and Donald Trump has implicated Ford a lot. And, he recently got into a big war of words with Donald Trump. Trump insulted him, saying that he wasn't as intelligent as his late brother, that he was a flunky of the prime minister. And Doug Ford hit back pretty hard as well, talking about Trump's bankruptcies. He got really personal. And then the following day, he comes out and he says, I got a little heated. I'm sorry. It's time to pull back and to kind of go back to the negotiating table and make a deal. And sometimes when I see him behaving like this, Bruce, I think this is really relatable to people. The way that he communicates, the way that he wears his anger on his sleeve. How much do you think his communication style has actually allowed him to surf the waves of this unpopularity at times?
I think it has. It's definitely helped him. And this is a good example. He's good at taking certain issues that come along and jumping on them. I mean, there's hypocrisy in this too, because it was also announced that something like over 400 workers with the Workers' Compensation Board are being laid off in Northern Ontario, and their jobs contracted out to American companies. So, I mean, this is classic Ford hypocrisy. He will champion on, nationalism and Canadian products and tariffs and all of this, like the airport, Billy Bishop Airport expansion. I mean, he's doing the bidding of an American bank. This is always sort of the annoying thing about guys like Ford. They are very skilled and adept at sort of coming across as populist. I mean, Trump's the same, right?
Right.
Saying certain key words, taking certain key positions, and people get caught up in it. And then they don't look at the minutia. They don't look at the fine print. They don't look at his track record. And Ford's track record is terrible. He's a terrible premier. He is One of the worst. And he's done incalculable damage to this province, but he's very good at selling himself as this common guy, this guy you could go out and have a beer with and have a smoke with.
Your piece documents the role that corporate lobbying has played throughout Ford's premiership. Who is it specifically who has been lobbying this government, and how do we know that their efforts successfully influenced Doug Ford and his cabinet?
So basically, he has set up a system of corruption. I mean, you could argue maybe it's legal corruption, it's depending on who you talk to. And the system is very straightforward. If you as a company want something from the government, whether it's a contract or a law that's going to benefit you or your industry, you donate to the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, the Tory party, and then you hire one of the lobbyists who has very close to Ford, who used to work for Ford or still works for Ford. I mean, the crazy thing is that a couple of the most powerful lobbyists, and one in particular, run his election campaigns and
That
still
would
give
be
him advice.
Corey Tonight, I think you're bringing up there,
That's
yes?
Corey Tonight and a guy called Chris Froggatt. They're giving Ford advice. They're running his campaigns. People hire them, and then they get contracts for these companies. Now, the sector of the economy that Ford has bent over backwards to help is the development industry. Going back many, many decades, he has been associated with that industry, is very friendly to the developers, and he does everything possible to give them what they want. And they want land. They want laws that allow them to build without environmental assessments, without having to pay local municipalities development fees, and it's that has been the agenda really from the beginning, is to do everything possible to help developers build wherever they want without any public input whatsoever.
And just as a follow-up to that, you mentioned the Greenbelt earlier. That was kind of the soul of the Greenbelt scandal, was Doug Ford opening up land that he promised in 2018 he would never open up, and doing so to the advantage of certain developers whose property values stood to increase in the billions because they were going to get to develop properties on or adjacent to this opened up Greenbelt land. And I thought it was really interesting in your piece how you documented that despite that being, I think, arguably the biggest scandal of Doug Ford's time in office, he's still doing things like that now after being caught, apologizing, and still being under RCMP active investigation.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't stopped. He got caught. I mean, basically because the green belt it's such a large amount of land. It has such an impact. And by the way, it took successive conservative, NDP Liberal governments to create the framework and put it into place. So this was not something that Tories were necessarily opposed to. But I mean, Ford going back to 2018, he was caught on camera when he was campaigning for the Tory leadership. Basically saying he wanted to open up a chunk of the green belt, and that he'd spoken to developers that this was their idea, but he liked it. Um, and then again, that there was backlash, so he backed off that and said, "Oh, he wouldn't touch the green belt." Um, but then he did everything possible to make that happen. But yeah, since despite having to back off that in 2023, there's been two highways, very unnecessary highways, by the way, that these development companies want built that cross their land. And again, it was the same pattern. uh, Tory connected lobbyists were hired. They pressed the government for the highways. The highways are being built. I didn't put this in my story, but the cabinet minister who had to resign because he'd taken $16,000 of public money to spend the night, even though he lived very quite close to the legislature, and was staying in downtown Toronto hotels. And then I think he also took tens of thousands from his riding association to pay for luxuries. His father owns land that one of these highways was going to cross, or and so there was again this conflict of interest because highways can create enormous financial benefit to those who own land along them, right? They can develop, open them up to development. They can build shopping centers on them, all sorts of stuff. So he has continued the practice. I mean, he shut down the Ontario Science Centre on a completely BS reason. And this was a beloved education center, by the way. He shut it down on the grounds that it couldn't be saved, it couldn't be salvaged. And anyone who knows anything about the building trades they think this is a crock of shit. They just think this is nonsense. And he's well, why did he do that? Well, because one of his developer friends bought 60 acres right beside it and wants to develop it on it. And so once the science center's gone, that land, I'm sure, will eventually be sold to his developer friend. The Ontario Science Centre is being moved to, the Ontario Place, which is another very lucrative piece of land that, again, he's redeveloping, also at ridiculous, like huge amounts of wasted money to a company that's very suspect. So it goes on and on. I mean, the thing, Desmond, that's kind of was really daunting with the story was like every week there's a new scandal. And the Ontario Federation of Labour has a website where they keep track of the scandals. And it goes on it just goes on and on and on. And it was really daunting going through it because it was like every week it was a new scandal. There was a new bit of damage they were doing. And it's so relentless. Like last week, they got caught. The Ontario PC party was discovered had been doing covert surveillance on Bonnie Crombie back in 2023, just after she was elected the new leader of the Liberal Party. She'd gone to vacation in Jamaica, and they sent someone down there to spy on her. Well, why? But then that gets, then they're on to the next thing with the free trade agreement, and he's back in the news, and it gets forgotten. But I think the result, I mean, you could say the good news is that this sort of 8 years of scandal, I think people just have gotten a bit fed up with it, and they're seeing the pattern that despite his sort of aw shucks, common man populist nonsense, that he favors corporations and the rich, and while he's also beggaring the province with underfunding and the public sector.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go next, because the two biggest responsibilities in the province of Ontario, of course, are healthcare and education, both of which you mention in the piece. We've had just over 8 years now of Doug Ford's governance. What has happened to these two pivotal ministries during the Ford era?
The Ontario government spends the least amount per capita. So I mean, like PEI, Newfoundland, spend more money per capita on their citizens in Ontario. And this is most, visibly seen in the healthcare sector. Someone I spoke to, who heads a coalition, is a proponent of the continued public support, public funding of healthcare. She told me that they feel what they've seen is the Ontario government is trying to wreck the healthcare sector in order to privatize it. So they underfund services. So people get fed up. Well, I can't get a doctor, which is true, and I can't get access to hospitals or healthcare or specialists. Well, now I'll go spend my own money on people who can provide the service quicker. And this is an old Tory trick. This is right-wing governments have done this going back decades. So I don't know whether that is the purpose, but it's definitely what's happening. It's something like 2.5 million people do not have access to through their own family physician. So that means they're going to hospitals, they're going to clinics if they need, if they need healthcare. The wait times in hospitals has gone up. You can wait a day or so to get a hospital bed, to get access to a doctor if you go to hospitals. And then the education sector, I mean, you see it really most explicitly in the university college system, where we actually had one of the universities in Ontario had to go into creditor protection because it was so broke. But they're all running deficits, uh, it's again, the Ontario spends the grossly less money per student than the rest of the country. Like, it's not even close. This is again, a sector. It produces educated populace that go on to create jobs and get employed doing important things, do research and development. Like, it's an enormously important sector for a complex, sophisticated economy, and they are gutting it. And one of the things that had happened under the previous Liberal government is they had, because tuition fees have been going up way, way too high for decades now, and they changed the loan grant program to favor grants over loans. Ford has changed that, so now students not only go into a university system that is woefully underfunded, but they're going to much more debt to get that education. And then, of course, they're having a hard time coming out of university to get a job because there's a huge white collar recession and nobody's hiring new graduates at the moment. So, I mean, it's the long term damage to the underfunding of the public sector is really alarming.
I mentioned earlier that despite some periods of serious unpopularity, Doug Ford has twice won re-election and majority government pretty easily during his time in office. What do you think this failure uh, to convert his um, his shortfalls into electoral penalties? What does that say about organized labor, about social movements in Ontario, even about the other opposition parties? Like, what does it say that despite all of these things that you can point to, despite this pages long list by the OFL, no movement or political party has been able to significantly weaken and take a bite out of Doug Ford?
So a couple things. One is he calls his first election. I mean, after 2018 in 2022. So it's still in the middle of COVID. So he's taking the COVID bump, and calls an election. So I mean, that wasn't a shocker that he won that election, because he had, as I said, he had made this move to the center, began to sound more reasonable, stopped fighting with Trudeau, etc. So that wasn't, and usually the voters are willing to give a government that's not grossly incompetent another term. Now, the other thing that kind of gets lost in this was that, one of the reasons the Tories were having a lot of trouble getting elected prior to 2018 was that the public sector unions were very effective at running ad campaigns against the Tories. The education unions, the teachers' unions, and nurses' unions, and whatnot, and they'd formed a coalition, and they were very adept at making the lives of the Tories miserable. So one of the first things that Ford does when he gets elected is he passes an illegal law to ban third-party advertising. So those ads could no longer play. And he knew the law was going to be challenged, and it was challenged, and that he knew it was unconstitutional. And sure enough, the Supreme Court said this was unconstitutional. But he times the elections, these two elections, during the period of time that ban's in place. So a lot of, the issue of cuts to education and to healthcare doesn't sort of enter the political mindset because the unions were prevented from doing so. He also lucked out enormously because of the opposition parties being weak. I mean, the NDP has formed government once, and that was a bit of a fluke. Um, but the Liberals came out of 2018 quite. I mean, they were reduced to 7 seats. They were broke, and then the first leader they got was not very inspiring, and then the second leader they got, Bonnie Crombie, who was more adept. For some reason, the party just got rid of her after one election, and so I'm not quite sure why they did that. The NDP last year ran what I consider a very dismal campaign against Ford. They really focused on their leader and not attacking Ford. But again, I think they were hamstrung by the fact that they're financially broke. So meanwhile, Ford has changed. he changed the limits on election spending, and the Tories are always more adept at raising money than anybody else. Um, so I think the other thing was that, as I said, with the election last year, the Supreme Court was going to come down with this decision on the ban on third-party advertising. I think it was in March, and he calls the election for like February. So he knew he had to get that election in. But now that's, he's in trouble now because the opposition is getting their act together. I mean, the Liberals are finding to have a new leader. The NDP have sharpened their attacks. They're getting much better, smarter on their feet. But ironically, with the Liberals not having a leader, they're polling better than the Tories at the moment. In regards to social movements and the labor movement, I mean, the labor movement has been opposed to Ford, but the labor movement is not the power it used to be. For one thing, the construction trade union industry supports Ford because he's given them a lot. The industrial unions just don't have the power they used to. There's a lot of division within the labor movement politically. And as I said, the public sector unions, which were really influential, really had their wings clipped by these laws that he's been passing. And social movements, and the problem social movements have is raising these issues that get into public conscience because they get ignored by the media.
So finally, Bruce, Doug Ford has continued doubling down on his authoritarian tendencies. There's been this whole issue of him changing the laws to bar access to his own phone records. He's been doing, it seems, government business on his personal phone and then denying access to those contents and has changed laws in order to keep that information hidden. You mentioned the expense issues that so many members of his caucus have been having, spending money questionably. You mentioned also Bonnie Crombie and the idea that the PC party seems to have gone and spied on her when she was on a vacation in Jamaica. And Ford just responded to that by shrugging his shoulders and saying, well, stuff happens. Stuff happens in politics. Given this slide and given the resurgence of his political adversaries and opposition, do you think we might expect another shift in his behavior as we've seen in the past to try and rescue his political fortunes?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think he's doing this with the trade issue now. He's he's portraying himself as Captain Canada again. So I mean, clearly he needs to do things like that if he wants to revive his popularity. I think there's a couple things. One is that he's now 8 years in. Usually, people get it's around this time people get kind of tired of their premiers. McGuinty, the previous Liberal premier, was around the same time that he stepped down, was after about 8 years, after he had just won an election. So, and at a certain point, for the party, I mean, the good news for the party is they don't face an election really for almost like for at least 3 years, almost 4 years. But if he continues to pull badly, which I imagine he will, because I think in many ways his true nature is coming out. He's one, I think he got cocky again, and he's just doesn't. And to your point, he doesn't seem to care about a lot of these scandals. I think one of the interesting things to see is that if he remains popular, whether the party deals with him. I basically realize this guy, because his numbers are lower than the party. But the party's numbers are drifting down too. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 3 years because I think it's not going to be fun for him.
Well, we will continue watching. Bruce's piece in The Breach is entitled The Rise and Potential Fall of Doug Ford, and we really appreciate you writing it and taking the time to come in and give us your thoughts and breakdown. Thanks so much for your time today, Bruce.
My pleasure, Desmond.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.